when controversial bill C-69 was being debated over the last couple of years, then that's the bill, the legislation that created the new Environmental Impact Assessment Act. One of the responses to criticisms by the government was that we'll fix this thing in regulations. And now and then, of course, it went over to the Senate, got amended, got passed back in the House, and now is law. But Professor David Wright from the University of Calgary law faculty has written a blog post about how it's now being, those regulations are being, in fact, tweaked, I guess we'll call them. So we're going to talk to David. David, welcome to the interview.
Thanks, Markham. Hi there.
So what do you make of my take on this, that it almost looks like the government is going back to its, or the regulator maybe, is going back to the original intent that we'll fix stuff in regulations?
Well, I think it's not uncommon what we're seeing here. So typically, you know, a statute comes into force and statutory provisions are only so detailed. It's not uncommon for the actual provisions in the law to be kind of bare bones. And so this is what a number of people expected. And again, you get this in environmental law, intellectual property law, anywhere. And so what's interesting here, though, is the government is choosing to do most of the detailing and the heavy lifting, therefore, at the level of guidance and not regulations. So if you look at the relevant regulations, time management, information management regulations, it's really, again, just a couple bare bones provisions that kind of says proponents, thou shall provide information on greenhouse gas emissions. And then it's left to the guidance level that's taken the form of the, quote, strategic assessment on climate change, where they're really setting out the detailed requirements, mostly informational requirements that proponents have to meet. But because it's guidance, it's a little bit loose and therefore technically not legally binding. There's a little bit of nuance there, but that's the state of affairs.
And I think one of the reasons why I find this interesting is because of the narrative that still exists out there that the Environmental Assessment Impact Act is death to new resource development. But you can see the government, if I'm reading this correctly, you can see the government grappling with this issue of how do we balance greenhouse gas emissions and environmental protection and still encourage development. Have I got that right?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting here is, I mean, Bill C-69, it's no secret, was a lightning rod. There was a lot of fear and anxiety around what it would mean for the oil and gas sector in particular. You know, as I said to some media outlets at the time, I don't think it really deserved that kind of criticism because, for better or worse, there aren't a lot of bright line, rigid rules and decision points in that act. And where there are decision points, there is a very large amount of room for the proponent and decision makers to maneuver. The climate change dimensions of the new statutory regime are a case in point, and perhaps the most illustrative case in point, where the thin provisions that we were talking about in the Act, in the assessment and decision-making phase, are now being detailed, and they're being detailed in a fairly toothless way. So on the bright side, a lot of valuable information must be put together now by proponents with respect to a project's greenhouse gas emissions and other dimensions. Yet that is not going to lead to a bright line yes/no decision on the climate change point in particular. So where some voices were asking for a rigid climate test, there is no rigid climate test within the statute, nor the guidance, nor the regulations.
Well, you address two climate or emissions issues or requirements under the new act. Let's start with the first one. If you could give us an overview and your take on it, please.
Well, sure. I mean, I've actually posted a series of blogs on our Faculty of Law blog called ABLAWG. So I got this embedded dad joke feature to it. But in a nutshell, you know, I walk through and say, you know, here's sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And on the good side of things, there are some helpful informational requirements that I think would be welcomed by almost everyone. So there's a requirement to speak to best available technology and best environmental practices. There's requirements to discuss impact to domestic and international climate change commitments. There's offsets features and so on. On the perhaps less good or bad side of things, there's still a fair amount of ambiguity throughout the guidance. And there are a few areas that are a little bit confusing or perhaps offer too much room to maneuver. We see that, for example, in this update, this surprise update that was just released a couple of weeks ago, where proponents are now allowed to actually, instead of talk about emissions and emission reduction steps with respect to the project specifically, proponents are actually allowed to point to, quote, corporate level action. So completely removed from the project, yet somehow kind of factored into a project's emissions. And perhaps the last point that you were picking up on, though, Markham, is myself and my very helpful research assistant looked at two of the first projects that are out of the gate completely under the Impact Assessment Act, not under the old regime. And what we found is that the agency is actually not sticking with the requirements set out in the guidance. So there's room to maneuver in the guidance. Okay, that should still be implemented and enforced in a fairly rigorous way. And it looks like these initial projects are being allowed to sidestep some of the early information submission requirements that are set out in the guidance.
Yeah, I was very interested in your comment about how the idea of corporate GHG emissions could be applied almost as a credit, I suppose, to the specific project under review. And I can imagine some of these companies are global in nature. They're based outside of Canada. Does that mean if you reduce emissions in China or the Gulf Coast of Mexico, something like that, that they could then be applied to that project?
Yeah, good question. And this is where details really do matter. So there are some parameters built into this recent change in the guidance. So those emission reductions, those corporate level action emission reductions have to be within Canada. They cannot be pursuant to some other law or regulation that requires it. So they have to be otherwise kind of voluntary, but now they can be counted in this regime. And there's a couple other parameters explicitly stated in the guidance. So there are some good safeguards. And of course, all this should be subject to rigorous monitoring, reporting and verification to safeguard against double counting, for example, to make sure that all the information is on the table and there's no black boxes. Yet it is a surprising level of flexibility in the impact assessment context, where typically the focus is on the project and not on what the corporate family is doing beyond the sort of the scope of assessment or scope of project at issue.
Final question, David. Based on what you've seen so far, does the new Environmental Assessment Impact Act and the projects that it's being implemented with so far, is this an improvement on CIA 2012 that the Harper government brought in?
It's a good question, and certainly that was the mindset of the government, was that this would improve things. So this is a longer conversation and depends on sort of what your metrics are for measuring whether or not this is an improvement. In general, I think the stage is set for there to be more public confidence in the federal regime, and therefore an investor certainty. There will be growing pains in the short term, but assuming this regime is in place for 3-5 years, I think you're going to see confidence and certainty growing. With respect to the climate change dimension specifically, it's quite clear that this is an improvement. Before this act, greenhouse gas emissions were still required, mostly just through requirements set out in any project's assessments terms of reference. Now at least you've got this explicit requirement in the act with detailed guidance, and so that's going to level the playing field. It's going to clear things up and start the steps needed towards more certainty. So quite clearly room for improvement, but also quite clearly a step in the right direction for federal impact assessment.
David, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it, and always appreciate your comments, and we'll be chatting with you again in the near future, I'm sure.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Markham.